Hello. We now come to the third of my videos on Alistair Parker's The Second World War, a Short History. This one dealing with Britain and British policy in the 1930s. This is all part of Chapter 1 on the political background to the origins of the European War. First, let me introduce you to Neville Chamberlain, the dominant political figure of the period, British Prime Minister from May 1937 up to May 1940. Of course, Britain is a parliamentary democracy, so he's not an absolute leader, unlike Hitler or Mussolini at the time. He has to negotiate with other members of his cabinet and also get parliamentary approval for his policies. He's probably one of the most controversial political leaders of the 20th century in Britain. So, Britain and Germany in the 1930s. It was certain that Hitler's leaning towards armed aggression and his assumption of an inevitable and constant struggle for existence would at some point lead to war. But it was British policy which largely determined how and when the war would occur. British governments were not opposed to rising German prosperity, which they assumed would actually improve British prosperity through trade. There was widespread British sympathy, moreover, for German complaints against the Treaty of Versailles. In the 1920s and even the 1930s, Britain pressed France to agree to some German rearmament and on the reparations issue. The British did little to help the French to maintain the territorial provisions of the Versailles Treaty. Most people in Britain would have welcomed a strong, prosperous, and peaceful Germany. But whilst Nazi Germany became strong and prosperous, its peacefulness wasn't certain and seemed threatening to British governments. This wasn't a fear of a direct threat to British interests. Unlike some non-Nazi Germans, Hitler didn't stress the return of German colonies, and Hitler claimed to desire Anglo-German understanding. German trading methods impinged on British trade in Southeast Europe and Latin America, but the overall impact on British trade was too small to provoke an armed response. Indeed, British ministers seem to have thought that a purely economic German dominance of southeastern Europe was an acceptable price for peace. However, German preparations for war and what could be discerned of Nazi intentions suggested a bid for Eastern European expansion. Hitler hoped that Britain would give him a free hand in the East in return for his acceptance of the British Empire and the status quo outside of Europe, and perhaps in Western Europe too. But for the British, this seemed dangerous. If Germany was allowed to become politically dominant in Eastern Europe, and French disinterest compelled France to abandon the East, then Germany would have a free hand to dominate the isolated Soviet Union, which would either face destruction or be compelled to collaborate with Germany. In Western Europe, France would then be unable to defend its own independence. A warlike Nazi state would then organize Europe to further increase German military power, making Britain itself hard to defend for long and making it dependent on German goodwill. Britain had to stop this process, so finally in 1939 it encouraged two of its allies, France and Poland, to risk war in order to check Hitler's advance. British interference in Europe to maintain a balance of power was the reason for the outbreak of World War II. British governments, even in 1939, didn't think much in these terms, though such objectives were assumed. Their policy was to maintain peace. The Nazi threat was vague, and the British government expressed the high-minded objectives required by the most articulate part of the electorate. They sought the rule of law, the frustration of aggression, the upholding of the principles of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and that the right of rights of weaker nations be secured by peaceful means. European appeasement seemed to be the appropriate policy until Chamberlain began to bring it into disrepute in 1938. This meant getting a peaceful Germany through a mix of conciliation and coercion, both attempts to arrange peaceful solutions to what might be seen as legitimate German grievances and threats of resistance to German aggression. Over time, an increasing number of policymakers and observers of events lost faith in the possibility of making durable bargains with Adolf Hitler, and the coercive element in British policy increased. The initial concessions offered to Germany were, quotes, surprisingly meagre. These included, in 1933-35, the legalization of German and recognition of German rearmament in return for agreed limits to German military strength, and in 1936-37, recognition of the end of the demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, which the Germans seized in March 1936, and the possibility of a very limited restoration of pre-war German colonies. British confidence that Germany could be pacified came from the belief that the original cause of Nazi aggressiveness had been the insistence on Germany's obedience to the Versailles Treaty. So once French governments had been bypassed or induced to be less rigid, all would be well. But British optimism was shaken by Germany's open rearmament in 1935 and the forcible remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, both clear violations of the Versailles Treaty. British governments agreed to rearm for possible war. The British still looked for inducements in colonial concessions in 1936-1937, and then in 1938, firmly led by Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister, sought to interfere in Central and Eastern Europe to arrange political concessions to suit Germany. They weren't much concerned with what the details of these concessions were. They were actually pursuing incompatible objectives. On the one hand, to change Europe sufficiently to make it acceptable to Hitler, or perhaps to other Germans who would be capable of restraining him, and on the other, to prevent the unchallengeable dominion of Europe by German military power. Nevertheless, this British appeasement made Britain the main obstacle to German expansion. Then, in March 1938, Hitler and Goering, then the lead influencer in the competitive circle around Hitler, used force to incorporate the Austrian Republic into Germany. Almost immediately, the Sudeten ethnic Germans living in the western border areas of Czechoslovakia were encouraged to demand the solution of their grievances, real and imagined. A first-class international crisis was in prospect. If Germany attacked Czechoslovakia, France was bound by treaty to come to its aid, as was the Soviet Union. If France was at war with Germany, Britain would almost certainly be drawn in. The British cabinet considered two responses. First, to join France in helping Czechoslovakia if Czechoslovakia was attacked. This was rejected. Chamberlain and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, felt it might precipitate an avoidable war with Germany. Other ministers feared that British defences were then too weak against possible German air attacks. A second response was a compromise with Germany to avoid war by responding to German grievances, but with a warning that Britain might help defend Czechoslovakia if Germany attacked. The Czech president, Beneš, being told that help to the Czechs was dependent upon him being, quotes, reasonable, a message echoed by France with British persuasion. In September 1938, Adolf Hitler threatened war if German grievances over Czechoslovakia were not met instantly. Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler at Berchtesgaden and agreed to a peaceful transfer of Czech territory occupied by Germans. France was persuaded to join in forcing Czechoslovakia to accept this. Though Britain haggled a little about timing, the Munich Agreement was a German success. It looked like an Anglo-French surrender. A great controversy has been aroused by appeasement, with some claiming that the Munich deal made war more likely rather than less. If Britain and France had only stood up to Hitler at that time, they would either have forced him to accept defeat, or, if he tried to go to war, he would have been overthrown. Some well-placed German military sources actually informed the British that Western resistance would have led to Hitler's overthrow. Instead, the Munich settlement enhanced Hitler's prestige and made any moves to restrain him in future less likely to succeed. Germany was also strengthened after Czechoslovakia's capitulation by an increase in its industrial capacity and the neutralization of the strong Czech army. The Allies' conduct in pressing Czechoslovakia to surrender also made it more difficult to rally future resistance to Germany, possibly including persuading Stalin to abandon his opposition to Hitler and to lead the Soviet Union into the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939. Britain and France's neglect of Soviet interests, the Soviet Union was left out of the Munich negotiations, led to much criticism at the time in the West, especially as it went with neglect of the League of Nations and the doctrine of collective security. There was a lot of support for the League in Britain, especially amongst liberals, progressives and socialists, as a means of preventing war through conciliation or coercion. But British governments deliberately avoided it and avoided the Soviet Union, which was prominent in the League of Nations after 1935, thinking that it would make it more difficult to reach settlements with Hitler. There was impassioned hostility towards Chamberlain for his policies, both then and later. At best, he could have argued that standing up to Hitler, with or without the League of Nations and the Soviet Union, involved a serious risk of war, which the German conspirators might not have been able to prevent. In 1938, it seemed likely that if there was going to be a war, then postponing it would lessen the chances that Germany might win. It was feared that a German air attack on Britain might inflict a knockout blow very quickly. Only in 1939 were British defences against air attack greatly strengthened by extending radar and increasing the number of single-seat monoplane fighters. It's clear that both before and after Munich, Chamberlain wasn't thinking how he could effectively and safely coerce Hitler, however. Rather, he believed that he'd discovered a means of securing peace by agreement, and he rarely doubted this idea. Thus, after Munich, Chamberlain disliked and resisted those preparations for war which he thought would provoke Hitler and make peace in our time more difficult. He didn't fully share the rising skepticism after Munich about the possibility of peace with Germany. There were good grounds for this suspicion about German intentions. Hitler had responded angrily to the accelerated British armament forced on Chamberlain by his cabinet after Munich, objecting to any British involvement and interference in continental Europe. Then there was the violent attacks on Jews in Germany in the Kristallnacht of the 10th November 1938, which aroused distaste for the Nazi regime and a lack of confidence in its trustworthiness. By January 1939, there was sufficient accumulated evidence that Hitler resented British peacekeeping in Europe so much that he was considering a preemptive strike against Britain, perhaps preceded by an invasion of the Netherlands. Above all, German occupation of the remaining Czech provinces in March 1939 and the granting of semi-independence to Slovakia convince most British politicians that there should be a maximum preparation for war, both through accelerated rearmament and encouraging the formation of alliances against Germany. This now seemed like the only way of averting war, either by inspiring fear in Hitler, or, as was hoped by some ministers and officials, causing German moderates, that's in inverted commas, soldiers, businessmen, bankers, to restrain Hitler, perhaps with the help of Goering. As far as we can tell, such views were shared by most British citizens, or at least the politically aware. By the summer of 1939, there was a general conviction in Britain that a determined attempt at peaceful cooperation with Germany had failed, and that a limit therefore had to be put on Hitler's forceful expansionism, and that this had to be backed by a clear threat of force. Even Chamberlain now accepted the need, though he still hoped or even expected that he could guide Hitler and Germany back to a peaceful compromise. It's hard to see that any British government could have avoided such an attempt, nor is it likely that British opinion would have been persuaded to accept the risk of another war without it. Thus Chamberlain agreed to a British pledge of support for Poland at the end of March 1939. If the Poles resisted an armed attack on their territory, which threatened their independence, then Britain would come to their aid. But Chamberlain also tried hard and unsuccessfully to stop British cabinet acceptance of an Anglo-French attempt to secure an alliance with the Soviet Union, as he thought this would cause German resentment at encirclement and thus lessen the chances of German restraint. Note, Chamberlain's attitude towards these negotiations may have finally caused Stalin to make a bargain with Hitler rather than join in resistance to him. If you're interested, Parker's also written a book on Chamberlain and Appeasement, so he's one of the experts in this field. So many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their encouragement and support, without which these videos wouldn't get made. You're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like and share, comment on the videos if you wish. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give links to Patreon and PayPal below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about the Polish crisis and French policy in the 1930s. Have a good day.